The Polikarpov Pa-2 was never intended for the front lines of the greatest air war in history. It was a primary trainer, a crop duster, made of spruce wood, plywood, and stretched cotton canvas. It had 2 open cockpits, a fixed landing gear that looked like bicycle wheels, and a 5-cylinder radial engine that produced a measly 100 horsepower. In a world of screaming jet prototypes and 1,000-horsepower interceptors, the Pa-2 was a relic of a bygone era. To the German Luftwaffe, they were Nähmaschinen, sewing machines, because of the rhythmic, clattering sound of their underpowered engines. But to the Soviet women of the 588th, these sewing machines were instruments of psychological warfare. Because the planes were made almost entirely of wood and fabric, they had a radar signature that was practically invisible to the primitive German tracking systems of 1943. More importantly, the Pa-2 had a stall speed that was lower than the minimum flight speed of the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. If a German ace tried to line up a Pa-2 in his sights, the Night Witch would simply slow down to 60 miles per hour, a speed at which the heavy German fighter would stall and fall out of the sky like a stone. The Night Witches operated in the dead of night, flying mission after mission, sometimes up to 15 in a single evening. Their tactic was as elegant as it was terrifying. They would fly toward the German encampments, and as they neared the target, they would cut their engines. In total silence, they would glide over the German lines, the only sound being the eerie whoosh of the wind through their wire stays. The Germans likened this sound to the sweeping of a broomstick, hence the name Night Witches. By 1943, the 588th had become more than a nuisance. They were a legitimate threat to German supply lines and morale. The Germans began offering the Iron Cross to any pilot who could confirm a kill against a Pa-2. But hunting a night which was like trying to catch a ghost with a sledgehammer. You couldn't see them on radar, you couldn't hear them coming, and if you tried to dogfight them, they would simply turn on a kopeck and disappear into the treeline. The stage was set for a clash of philosophies, the ultimate expression of German engineering versus the raw, defiant ingenuity of the Russian women in their flying crates. Major Erich von Richter was a creature of the high-altitude, high-velocity kill. With over 50 confirmed victories on the Eastern Front, he was a celebrated expert of the Luftwaffe, a pilot who treated aerial combat like a mathematical equation. His mount was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the Gustav, a fuel-injected, 1,400 horsepower engine wrapped in sleek, stressed-skin duralumin. It was a silver bullet designed to scream through the sky at 400 miles per hour. To von Richter, the war was a series of rapid-fire snapshots through a Revy reflector sight. By the summer of 1943, von Richter's wing had been moved to the southern front near the Taman Peninsula. His mission was simple: clear the night sky of the nuisance bombers. The German High Command was losing sleep, literally. The constant, rhythmic putt-putt of the Soviet Pa-2 biplanes was grinding the morale of the ground troops into the mud. The soldiers began to believe the Night Witches were supernatural, that they could see in the dark like owls and disappear into the mist like ghosts. Von Richter, a Prussian pragmatist, scoffed at the superstition. To him, a plane made of wood and canvas was simply a bonfire waiting for a match. He began flying solo, free hunts at night, a dangerous game for a pilot used to daytime dogfights. The Bf 109 was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was blind in the dark. Its landing gear was narrow and treacherous, and its cockpit offered poor visibility. To find the witches, von Richter had to rely on the German searchlight batteries on the ground. He would loiter at 10,000 feet, watching the fingers of white light sweep the clouds, waiting for the moment a searchlight coned a slow-moving biplane. The first time he saw a Pa-2 in his sights, he laughed. It looked like a kite from the Great War. He dived, his Daimler-Benz engine roaring, his thumb hovering over the cannon trigger. But as he closed the gap at 300 miles per hour, something impossible happened. The biplane didn't dive, it didn't bank. It simply stopped. Or so it seemed. The Pa-2 had slowed to its minimum flight speed, and von Richter, traveling 4 times faster, overshot the target in a fraction of a second. He pulled up into a steep climb, looking back, but the sky was empty. The witch had vanished into the shadows of a ravine. Von Richter became obsessed. He stopped hunting the Soviet yaks and Sturmoviks. He wanted the witches. He began to study their flight paths, noting their preference for low-altitude hedge-hopping. He realized that to kill a witch, he had to stop flying like an ace and start flying like a scavenger. He didn't know that on the other side of the line, a young Soviet pilot named Nadezhda Popova was studying him, too. The hunter was being mapped, his patterns analyzed by women who had nothing to lose but their plywood wings. By mid-1943, the 588th Regiment had realized that Major von Richter was no longer just a pilot. He was a stalker. He had downed 2 of their sisters in a single week, using high-speed slash-and-run tactics that left the slow biplanes no time to maneuver. The commander of the Night Witches, Marina Raskova, knew that to kill a shark, you had to lure it into shallow water. She devised a bait-and-switch maneuver that required nerves of cold Siberian steel. The mission was set for a night with heavy low-level mist. Usually, the witches flew in pairs, but this time, 3 P2s took off from the hidden grass airstrip. 2 of them, piloted by veterans Nadezhda Popova and Raisa Aronova, were the Anvils. They flew low, skimming the tops of the sunflower fields, their engines throttled back to a whisper. The third plane, the Hammer, flew 500 feet higher and slightly behind, positioned in the dead zone where a German fighter pilot would least expect to look while diving. Popova intentionally broke the first rule of the 588th. She kept her engine running loud and steady. She steered her plywood crate directly toward a known German searchlight battery near the Tamon bridgehead. As expected, the long fingers of white light began to claw at the sky. One beam caught her, coning the fragile biplane in a brilliant, blinding glare. To anyone watching from above, she was a sitting duck, a silver moth pinned against a black velvet curtain. High above, von Richter saw the glow. He didn't see the other 2 P2s lurking in the shadows of the ravine. He only saw his 51st kill. He rolled his Messerschmitt onto its back and pulled into a vertical power dive. The wind shrieked over his canopy as his airspeed indicator climbed past 350 miles per hour. He was moving 5 times faster than his target. He lined up the glowing biplane in his ready sight, his finger tensing on the 20mm cannon trigger. But the witch wasn't panicking. Popova was watching the reflection of the searchlight on her own wings. She waited until she could hear the scream of the Daimler-Benz engine over her own clattering radial. At the precise moment von Richter committed to his firing pass, Popova kicked her rudder hard and chopped the throttle. The P2 didn't just turn, it pivoted in mid-air, dropping 300 feet in a controlled stall. Von Richter's cannons erupted, but the tracers streaked through the empty space where Popova had been a second before. He had bitten the bait, and as he overshot at terminal velocity, the Hammer and the Anvil began to close the trap. As Major von Richter screamed past Nadezhda Popova's biplane, he realized he had committed the ultimate sin of an ace. He had lost his situational awareness. He was a victim of his own momentum. To regain his position, he had to pull the heavy Messerschmitt into a massive, wide-diameter loop. In the time it took the German fighter to complete a single turn, the P2 had already pivoted 180 degrees within its own wingspan. The Night Witch wasn't dogfighting, she was dancing. The maneuvering advantage of the P2 was a quirk of its primitive design. Because its wing loading was so low, essentially a large surface area carrying very little weight, it could perform impossible aerodynamic feats. Popova pulled her nose up, bleeding off almost all her airspeed, and kicked the rudder. The biplane performed a flat yaw turn that would have snapped the wings off a modern fighter. While von Richter was fighting G-forces that threatened to black him out, Popova was calmly leveling her wings, her navigator, Katya, already unholstering a light machine gun from the rear cockpit. The combat dropped to treetop level. This was the Night Witch's home turf. Popova dived into a narrow, fog-filled ravine where the trees almost brushed her landing gear. Von Richter, desperate to not let his 51st kill slip away, followed her down. But the Bf 109 was never meant for hedge-hopping. Its long nose obscured the pilot's forward view, and at 250 miles per hour, a single second's hesitation meant a collision with the Earth. Von Richter found himself in a nightmare of perspective. Every time he lined up a shot, the P2 would simply hop over a line of poplars or dip behind a farmhouse. The German ace was forced to constantly pull up to avoid the ground, while the Soviet women stayed low, using the terrain as a physical shield. The Messerschmitt superior engine was now its greatest enemy. It was too powerful for the confined space of the low-altitude duel. Suddenly, the searchlights from the German battery, previously von Richter's greatest tool, began to work against him. The beams reflected off the white morning mist, creating a milk bowl effect that blinded the German pilot. In that moment of disorientation, the second and third P2s, which had been lurking in the dead zone above, began their descent. They weren't just observers anymore. They were the closing jaws of a trap that von Richter had flown into with his eyes wide open. The sewing machines were about to become executioners. The climax of the duel occurred less than 50 feet above the dark, surging waters of the Kirke River. Major von Richter was tilted on his wing, pulling a high G turn to stay behind Nadezhda Popova's biplane. His engine was screaming, a mechanical howl that echoed off the canyon walls. He was so focused on the moth in his crosshairs that he didn't see the shadow descending from above. Raisa Aronova, piloting the Hammer P2, had cut her engine entirely. In the absolute silence of a dead-stick glide, she dropped out of the moon bank directly onto the German's tail. This was the Night Witch's signature move, the silent strike. There was no engine roar to warn von Richter's ears, no heat signature for his instincts to flare. There was only the sudden, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a handheld DA machine gun firing from the rear cockpit of the biplane. The bullets didn't shred the Messerschmitt's armored cockpit, but they didn't have to. A single burst of tracer rounds punctured the radiator of the Bf 109. Instantly, a plume of white glycol steam erupted from the German's engine, blinding von Richter and spraying over his windscreen. In a high-performance fighter, a lost radiator is a death sentence. The engine begins to seize within seconds. Panic, a sensation von Richter hadn't felt since flight school, surged through him. He slammed his throttle forward, trying to climb out of the kill zone, but the overstressed Daimler-Benz engine coughed, sputtered, and died. He was now a 6,000-pound brick of metal traveling at 200 miles per hour, with no altitude to trade for glide distance. Popova, watching from her own cockpit, saw the German ace's wings wobble. She didn't fire another shot. She simply banked her plywood biplane and watched as the pride of the Luftwaffe, the man with 50 kills, stalled out. The Messerschmitt's left wing clipped the top of a massive oak tree, pivoting the aircraft violently. It cartwheeled into the marshy bank of the river, a spectacular explosion of fire and twisted duralumin that lit up the night for miles. The three P2s didn't linger. They didn't perform a victory roll. They simply throttled up their 100-horsepower engines and disappeared back into the mist, their sewing machines humming a steady, indifferent tune. They had proven the impossible, that in the right hands, a relic of the past could dismantle the future. The Night Witches had claimed their most prestigious victim, not with superior technology, but with a superior understanding of the dark. The recovery of Major Erich von Richter's flight diary after the war provided a chilling, first-hand account of what it was like to be hunted by the 588th. His entries from the summer of 1943 transitioned from arrogant dismissals of peasant aircraft to a profound, almost spiritual respect for the women who flew them. In his final entry before being sent back to Germany for surgery, he wrote, "We were told we were fighting a primitive enemy, flying toys made of sticks and rags. But tonight, the sky belonged to the ghosts. They do not fly like pilots. They fly like vengeful spirits. They cut their engines and become one with the wind. To hit them is to try and shoot the fog. I have 50 victories against the best machines the Soviets could build, but it was a sewing machine that finally brought me to the earth. There is no shame in this defeat, only a terrifying realization that we are fighting women who have traded their souls for wings." The German soldiers on the ground began to share this sentiment. They stopped laughing at the Nomaschinen. They noticed that the Night Witches never missed. They realized that these women weren't just dropping bombs. They were dropping fear. The psychological toll was so high that German troops were promised a tank destruction badge, or an Iron Cross, for every P2 they managed to bring down, a reward usually reserved for destroying heavy tanks or elite fighters. For Nadezhda Popova and her sisters, the respect of the enemy was a grim trophy. They didn't fly for medals or for the diaries of German aces. They flew because their homes were burning. By the end of the war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown over 30,000 missions and dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. They were the most highly decorated female unit in the Soviet Air Force, producing 23 heroes of the Soviet Union. The last stand of the Night Witches wasn't a single battle, but a continuous, 3-year defiance of the laws of physics and the expectations of gender. They proved that a 100-horsepower biplane could defeat a 1,400-horsepower interceptor through sheer tactical brilliance. When the war ended, the Pa-2s were retired to museums, and the Night Witches returned to civilian life, many of them never flying again. But in the annals of aerial combat, the story of the wood and canvas ghosts, who broke the spirit of the Luftwaffe, remains the ultimate testament to the power of the underdog.